You told them anybody you knew had been a left-winger or a communist, and you went home. And if you said, I wasn't going to do that, I didn't know that these people had committed any crimes, and I'd known a lot of them in my days in the 30s, 20 years before. The farce was too much to stomach. So I had to go through a federal trial and was found guilty of contempt of Congress for refusing to answer some questions. So I wrote The Crucible. That took place, of course, in Salem, Massachusetts in 1692. And the reason I think that I moved in that direction was that it was simply impossible any longer to discuss what was happening to us in contemporary terms. There had to be some distance given the phenomenon. We were all going slightly crazy, trying to be honest and trying to see straight and trying to be safe. The hysteria in Salem had a certain inner procedure, or several, which we were duplicating once again. And that perhaps by revealing the nature of that procedure, some light could be thrown on what we were doing to ourselves. And that's how that play came to be.
Now, the characters in The Crucible are pressed to not only confess, but to name names, to name other names. And that, of course, was going on at the time. Indeed, it was going on at the time and involving some of your closest friends and associates. The writer who you probably admired most in the 30s, as far as I can recall, Clifford Odets, who named name, Kazan, named names, the man who played Willy Loman in the initial production Death of a Salesman, I think, named names. Don't I recall that you actually heard Kazan naming names as you drove back from Salem? What was the impact of all of that on you at the time?
It was rather like a dream, because the people these men were naming were, of course, all known to the government. And they made a point of saying, we know who these people are, then why did we have to name them? Well, you had to name them in order to establish your credibility as a patriot. In other words, it was a ritual that had no practical meaning. It was now purely to feed the endless appetite of certain politicians and to scare people, and it just seemed so absurd and maddening that people were being torn apart, their loyalty to one another crushed, and just common decency was going down the drain. And it's indescribable, really, because you get the feeling that nothing was going to be sacred anymore.
The beginning of The Crucible, I guess, goes back to the time I was in college when I began to become interested in that phenomenon, but it just seemed like a very weird event in American history. And I didn't do anything about it, I just knew about it. But when the McCarthy period started, so-called McCarthy period, because that's a bit of a misnomer, there were many McCarthys here, it kept recurring to me that what we were going through was a kind of ritual which had almost a religious overtone, even though the idea of religion never entered it as such. And I didn't know how to handle that. I felt that there would be no response to McCarthyism unless it was on a level that the McCarthyism was. That is to say, they were dealing in a mystique. Because the truth of the matter is that the people that they were accusing of being un-American or treasonous either hadn't been, or what they had really believed in, was a common belief only 7 or 8 years before this. In other words, they had managed, very adroitly I must say, to switch around the political poles of this country, so that if a man had, for example, during World War II, passionately believed that the Russians were saving the West by resisting Hitlerism and taking on by far the bulk of the German army, which was the common belief in 1942, let's say, 43, 44, by 6 years later, this was a treasonous belief. Well, it would make you gasp to try to turn people back to where they had been 5 or 6 years ago. And the logic didn't have any part in this. You couldn't bring out a newspaper and say, well, look, don't you remember 5 or 6 years ago these people were saving us, and now they're destroying us? There has to be some lapse of logic in this damn thing, no? No. You could believe both things at the same time. So I had to transcend that logic somehow. Just as in Salem, when someone objected, for example, to the arrest of a woman like Rebecca Nurse, who was renowned all over the place for being a very devout lady, and she had, which was unusual at the time, set up a charity for poor people, because unlike the usual romantic picture of New England at the time, there was a certain large number of people who had neither land nor a job, were sleeping in ditches, were outcasts practically because they were poor, and a lot of them were drunks, and so on. And she attempted to do something about these people. So, when she was accused of witchcraft and somebody said, well, how is that possible? She's done nothing but good in her life. As I have the Reverend Hales say in the play, remember, until an hour before the devil fell, God thought him beautiful in heaven. That's exactly the kind of person that would be a traitor, is the one who doesn't appear to be. These are the most perfectly disguised witches. Maybe I ought to mention, before I forget it, that I was in Salem 6 months ago or so, and because they were unveiling the model of a monument that finally, after 300 years or whatever it was, they've gotten around to making a monument to the dead. And I had a press conference there, and these were people from all the big newspapers and wire services. And I realized in talking to them that they kept referring to them as witches. The idea being that you shouldn't hang witches. You shouldn't kill witches. Presumably you should, I don't know what, put them in jail or exorcise them. And I said, hey, wait a minute. These people weren't witches. There was a dead silence came. I said these were innocent political victims of a manufactured Holocaust. Well, I can't tell you the dislocation of the mind that occurred. And one woman, actually from the Boston Globe, the reporter said, but you mean there was no evil among them? So you see, this is not a phenomenon from 1692 or 1952 or anything like it. It is right now. The objection that there were no witches, but there were communists, I would only recommend that somebody who believes that or says that should go back to 1692, stand in the public square of Salem, Massachusetts, and say, you know, there are no witches. He'd be dead. Quick. There were witches. They were everywhere. Everybody knew that. If you were a Christian, you knew there were witches because it said so in the Bible. And Saul said, thou shalt not suffer a witch to live.